It was a gray morning in occupied France, 1943. The air smelled of damp stone and fear. In a small cell near Rouen, a man sat silently, staring at the cracks in the wall. His name was Michel Hollard, a French engineer, a father, and the last person the Gestapo wanted to see alive. For the 12th time, he had done the impossible, escaped, crawling through sewers, clinging beneath trains, walking miles through enemy lines. Every time he slipped through their fingers, they called him a ghost. But every time, the war dragged him back, chained, beaten, and defiant. He was the man who refused to die, the spy who vanished and reappeared like smoke. Yet no one could understand why he kept risking everything for a country already broken. To understand how he escaped 12 times and why he kept getting caught, we have to go back to where it all began. The year was 1940. France, once proud and radiant under the light of Paris, had fallen into shadow. The German army marched through its streets with boots that echoed like thunder, their flags unfurling across the nation as if to choke the very air. The world was at war again, and Europe was breaking under the weight of a tyranny no one dared to challenge alone. In those early days of occupation, fear became a language everyone understood. Neighbors vanished overnight. Posters of Marshal Pétain promised peace, while whispers of betrayal filled the cafes. The Gestapo moved silently, their eyes everywhere, in offices, in schools, even in the churches where people prayed for deliverance. And yet, among the silence of surrender, small sparks of defiance began to glow in secret rooms under candlelight, behind false walls. Michel Hollard was not a soldier, he was a civil engineer, calm, methodical, and precise. Born in 1898, he had lived through the trenches of the First World War, seen the mud, the blood, the endless waiting. He knew what defeat smelled like, and he swore never to let it happen again. By 1940, he was a family man working for a timber company, an ordinary man living in extraordinary times. But the moment he saw the swastika fly over France, something inside him hardened. He could not stand idly by while his country was humiliated. At first, his resistance was simple, helping refugees cross into Switzerland, carrying messages, smuggling ration cards. But each act of defiance came with a growing risk. Switzerland became his lifeline. Neutral territory, a world away from the boots of the Gestapo. And it was on one of those crossings that his destiny took shape. A chance meeting with British intelligence officers changed everything. They didn't see an engineer. They saw an opportunity. A man who could move through occupied France unnoticed. A man whose discipline could be a weapon sharper than any gun. The world of espionage was nothing like the movies. It was cold, lonely, and filled with doubt. Every face on the street could be a spy. Every friend could be an informant. Hollard built his network quietly, methodically, a web of men and women bound not by rank but by conviction. He named it Réseau Agir, to act. And act they did. Hidden in plain sight, they mapped German installations, noted troop movements, and smuggled information across borders that were meant to be impenetrable. The tension across France was unbearable. By 1942, the Nazi war machine was perfecting a new kind of weapon, the V-1 flying bomb. It was a weapon of terror, designed to erase cities, to crush morale, to make resistance seem pointless. The British had heard rumors, but they needed proof. They needed eyes on the ground. And Michel Hollard, the quiet engineer from Normandy, was the one who could give it to them. But the deeper he went, the narrower his path became. One mistake meant death. His missions required him to travel hundreds of miles by train, often with forged papers that could crumble under a single stare. He carried blueprints, sketches, and coded reports, tucked inside false-bottom briefcases, sometimes even stitched into his clothes. He became a ghost among men, blending in, vanishing, reappearing. Still, Hollard was not driven by glory or vengeance. His cause was something simpler: duty. He believed that one man, even alone, could make a difference. And as the Nazis grew more brutal, his small acts of courage became blows against an empire. Yet danger always followed. The Gestapo had begun to notice the invisible threads connecting villages and safe houses. They could sense something moving beneath their control, a shadow network that seemed to vanish every time they got close. The air in occupied France grew thicker with suspicion. The resistance was hunted, infiltrated, and betrayed from within. And in the midst of it all stood Michel Hollard, an unassuming man in a wool coat, carrying a briefcase that could alter the course of the war. Michel Hollard's war began not with a gun, but with a train ticket. His journeys to Switzerland became the arteries of a lifeline between occupied France and the free world. To the border guards, he was just another engineer traveling for work. To British intelligence, he was a miracle, a courier who could slip across enemy lines again and again, unseen. Each time he crossed the border, he carried with him fragments of truth, sketches of bridges, railway depots, secret facilities, small pieces that, when assembled, would reveal the skeleton of Hitler's vengeance weapons. His early network, Réseau Agir, was a fragile creation, made of ordinary people who risked everything for the idea of freedom. There were postal clerks who switched letters, priests who passed coded messages through confessionals, and railway workers who memorized the schedules of German supply trains. Hollard's method was not reckless. It was disciplined. He believed order could defeat chaos. Precision could defeat terror. By 1942, his missions had become routine, at least as routine as defying the Gestapo could be. Every few weeks, he traveled hundreds of kilometers through occupied territory to meet his British contacts in neutral Switzerland. The meetings took place in discreet cafes under the pretext of business discussions. Over coffee and folded newspapers, Hollard passed intelligence so detailed that MI6 began to rely on him more than any other source in France. He had become their ghost in the ruins. But ghosts attract hunters. The Gestapo had begun to suspect that someone, was slipping through their net. Patrols along the Swiss border intensified. Trains were searched more often. Even the Swiss guards, once indifferent, had grown wary of travelers who came too often. Still, Hollard pressed on. He told his wife nothing. He believed silence was the best protection for those he loved. Each mission became a test of nerve. He learned to control his heartbeat when German soldiers boarded his train. He practiced his smile until it felt natural. He carried false papers with different names, different professions, each one tailored to the place he was headed. He was never careless, but he was not invincible. One winter night, as he trudged through snow-covered woods toward the Swiss border, he fell into an icy stream. The shock nearly froze him, but he dared not stop. If the German patrols found his trail, it would be over. By dawn, half conscious, he stumbled across the border and collapsed in a Swiss farmhouse. When he awoke, he was surrounded by strangers who whispered his name with awe. Le fantôme français, the French ghost. But even ghosts grow tired. The war stretched on, and Hollard's missions grew bolder. When word reached London of a secret German weapon being tested along the French coast, it was Hollard who volunteered to find it. The British called it the pilotless aircraft. The Nazis called it Vergeltungswaffe 1, the Vengeance Weapon 1. With nothing but his wits and a few loyal men, Hollard began to map the V1 launch sites scattered across northern France. He traveled by bicycle, disguised as an inspector of rural fuel depots. From hilltops and church towers, he counted fuel trucks, measured the shadows of concrete ramps, and memorized the angles of steel rails pointing toward the English Channel. Each observation was drawn carefully into sketches that he later smuggled to Switzerland, sketches that would end up on Winston Churchill's desk. By early 1943, Hollard had identified over 70 V1 sites. The information he delivered allowed the RAF to launch preemptive bombings that destroyed dozens of launch ramps before the weapon could ever be used. Thousands of lives in London were saved by the precision of one Frenchman with a pencil and a plan. But the more success he had, the closer danger crept. His network was spreading too far, too fast. Each new recruit was another potential leak, another risk. In early 1944, one of his couriers was captured near Rouen under torture. The man revealed a name, not Hollard's, but one close enough to start a trail. The Gestapo began to close in. In February 1944, as Hollard prepared for yet another crossing into Switzerland, he sensed something was wrong. The train station felt different, quieter, colder. He noticed two men in black coats watching him from opposite platforms. When the whistle blew, he boarded anyway. Halfway through the journey, the train stopped for inspection. He smiled, presented his forged papers, and for a moment, he thought he had fooled them again. Then came the click of a pistol. "Michel Hollard," the officer said. "You've been expected." He was dragged from the carriage, his briefcase seized, his papers scattered. The Gestapo had finally caught the man who had humiliated them for years. He was taken to Fresnes prison, then transferred to the Gestapo headquarters in Paris, a place where screams were muffled by thick walls. The interrogations were merciless. They beat him until his ribs cracked. They starved him, hung him by his wrists, demanded the names of his agents. But Hollard said nothing. When one officer mocked him, saying, "We'll see how many times you can escape now," Hollard simply replied, "As many times as it takes." Incredibly, he did escape. Not once, but multiple times throughout his imprisonment, he slipped out during transfers, fled through courtyards, hid in farmhouses. Yet fate seemed to drag him back each time. The Gestapo hunted him relentlessly. Every time he tasted freedom, betrayal, or bad luck caught him again. It was as if destiny itself was mocking his defiance. By mid-1944, he was sent to the Buchenwald concentration camp, a place where hope went to die. Few survived there, and even fewer dared to try. But Hollard refused to give up. He had seen the maps, the rockets, the faces of men who would never fight back. He owed it to them to endure. Inside the camp, he became a silent symbol of resistance, a man who would not break. The guards beat him, starved him, humiliated him, but he never surrendered a name. Each time he was caught, each time he escaped, each time he was dragged back, his legend grew among the prisoners. He was no longer just Michel Hollard, the engineer or the spy. He was something greater, a reminder that courage could survive even in hell. And yet, his story was far from over. The air in Buchenwald was thick with ash. Smoke from the crematorium clung to every breath, turning lungs to fire. The prisoners moved like ghosts, hollow faces, sunken eyes, and steps that barely disturbed the frozen ground. It was early 1945, and the camp was bursting with those the Reich no longer had room for. Spies, soldiers, professors, priests. Anyone who had dared to dream of a different world. Among them was Michel Hollard, thinner now, his ribs sharp beneath his uniform, but his spirit unbroken. He had been in captivity for months, enduring torture, starvation, and disease. Every morning, he was dragged out for roll call, forced to stand for hours as guards shouted, beat, and shot anyone who faltered. Hollard had seen hundreds die, some quietly, some screaming, yet he refused to bend. In his pocket, he carried nothing but a fragment of paper torn from a notebook. On it, faint lines of numbers, coordinates, angles, memories of the V1 sites he had once mapped. He had nothing left to give, but he refused to let them take his mind. Outside the barbed wire, the world was shifting. Allied bombers roared overhead, shaking the ground with each distant explosion. The guards pretended not to notice, but fear had crept into their eyes. They knew the war was slipping away. The Nazis had gambled everything on terror and lost. But inside the camp, the prisoners could not yet celebrate. For them, every sunrise meant another day of survival. Then came the order. In April 1945, as American troops advanced toward central Germany, the SS decided to erase the evidence of their crimes. Thousands of prisoners were to be executed or forced into death marches before the Allies arrived. Buchenwald was next. Trucks arrived, guards barked commands, and lists were read. Hollard's name was among them. He stood in line, silent, as the guards herded them toward the trucks. The air was cold, biting. He looked up at the gray sky and thought of his wife, his children, his country, and the countless lives his intelligence had saved. Perhaps, he thought, this was enough. But something deep within him refused to die quietly. He had escaped 12 times before. Why not a 13th? That night, as the camp sank into uneasy darkness, he began to plan. The guards were distracted, drunk on fear and fatigue. The chain of command was breaking apart. Hollard noticed small things: a loose section of fence, a distracted sentry, a power outage that briefly cloaked the yard in shadow. He whispered to a fellow prisoner, a Belgian doctor named Henri, who had tended his wounds. "Tomorrow," Hollard said. "We try tomorrow." The next morning, chaos erupted. Allied aircraft thundered overhead, strafing German convoys near the camp. Alarms blared, guards shouted orders, dogs barked madly. Amid the confusion, Hollard and a handful of prisoners slipped from their barracks and crawled beneath the shadows of the outer fence. The barbed wire tore at their clothes and skin, drawing blood, but they pressed forward. A spotlight flickered on, then off. Gunfire erupted. Men screamed. Hollard didn't stop. He reached the outer trench, dove into the mud, and rolled under the second fence. For a moment, freedom was within reach. Cold air, open forest, silence. But then came the command. "Führer!" Bullets ripped through the air. The man beside him fell, face first into the dirt. Hollard kept crawling, heart pounding, breath burning. Then, darkness. When he awoke, he was back inside the camp. Caught again. His leg was bandaged crudely, his body bruised. A guard had clubbed him unconscious just meters from the forest. The Gestapo officer in charge approached him later that day, sneering. "You really don't learn, do you?" the man said. Hollard, bleeding and broken, simply looked up and whispered, "Neither do you." The officer struck him across the face. "You think your England will save you?" he hissed. Hollard didn't answer. He didn't need to. He could already hear the distant thunder of artillery, the sound of freedom closing in. Days turned to hours. The SS began burning documents, abandoning posts. The prisoners sensed the end, but none dared to hope too loudly. On April 11th, 1945, the camp erupted. The guards fled as the prisoners rose in revolt. Armed with stolen rifles and makeshift weapons, they stormed the watchtowers, cutting the power, tearing down the gates. Hollard, limping but alive, joined the chaos, not as a soldier, but as a witness. When the first American tanks rolled through the gates of Buchenwald that afternoon, the prisoners cheered with voices cracked from starvation. They waved rags, cried, collapsed. Liberation had come at last. For Michel Hollard, it was the 13th escape, the one that finally held. He was carried from the camp by fellow inmates, his face pale, his body shaking. An American medic handed him water. He drank slowly, staring at the sky. After years of captivity, the clouds above looked impossibly bright. But the joy was mixed with grief. Around him lay hundreds of corpses, men who had not lived to see this day. Later, as the Americans processed survivors, Hollard's name surfaced. "You're Michel Hollard?" one officer asked, astonished. "The man from MI6 reports?" Hollard nodded faintly. "Then, sir," the officer said, "London owes you everything." But Hollard said nothing. He simply stared at the horizon, toward the west, toward home. The journey back to France was long and painful. He weighed barely 100 pounds, his bones fragile, his lungs scarred. But when he crossed the border and saw the French countryside again, something within him steadied. He had survived 12 captures, 12 escapes, 12 brushes with death. And yet, somehow, it still didn't feel like victory. Back in Paris, the war was ending. Crowds filled the streets, singing La Marseillaise, waving flags. The city that had once knelt under the swastika now stood proud again. But for men like Hollard, the celebration felt distant. He had seen too much: the burned villages, the broken bodies, the eyes of men who had no graves. He returned quietly to his family. His wife wept when she saw him, thinner than a shadow but alive. His children clung to him as if afraid he might vanish again. He told them little about what he'd endured. When asked how he had survived, he simply said, "Because I refused not to." In the months that followed, British officials came to France to honor him. Churchill himself was informed that the intelligence from Hollard's network had prevented untold devastation in London. The RAF had destroyed over 100 V-1 launch sites based on his reports. The British called him the man who saved London. Yet Hollard never sought glory. When journalists asked him about his escapes, he dismissed them with quiet humor. "I was not brave," he said. "I was stubborn." But those who knew him, the agents who had served under him, the soldiers who had read his reports, told a different story. They spoke of a man who crossed enemy lines on foot, who faced the Gestapo's cruelty without yielding, who escaped captivity 12 times, yet always returned to the fight. A man whose courage was not loud, but relentless. Even as peace returned, Hollard carried the weight of war. Nightmares haunted him. The sound of boots, the crack of rifles, the faces of those who never made it back. But he never let the darkness win. Instead, he built bridges, homes, new lives. He became, once again, the engineer he had always been, this time rebuilding a country he had helped to save. In the silence of post-war France, his story faded from the headlines. But among those who had known him, the resistance fighters, the survivors of Buchenwald, the intelligence officers in London, Michel Hollard's name was spoken with reverence, because in a world where so many broke under the weight of evil, he never did. He escaped 12 times. He was captured 12 times. And in the end, he still won. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe awoke like a wounded giant, scarred, limping, but alive. For Michel Hollard, survival was not victory. Liberation had freed his body, but the war still lived inside him. The echoes of gunfire and the cold air of prison cells clung to his memory like a shadow that would never fade. He had returned to France a hero, yet he carried himself like a man still on a mission, quiet, humble, and unwilling to call himself brave. After the liberation of Buchenwald, Hollard spent months recovering in Swiss and French hospitals. His body was frail, his nerves shattered, but his mind, the mind that had mapped Hitler's terror, remained sharp. Letters arrived from London. Commendations, medals, promises of gratitude. The British called him the man who saved London. The intelligence he gathered had allowed the Royal Air Force to destroy dozens of V-1 launch sites before the first rocket could even cross the Channel. In a single act of defiance, one French engineer had changed the course of the air war. When he was strong enough to travel, Hollard was invited to Buckingham Palace. There, in a quiet ceremony, King George VI awarded him the Order of the British Empire, a rare honor for a foreign civilian. Churchill himself sent a personal note of thanks, but true to his nature, Hollard accepted it without fanfare. "I only did what was right," he told reporters. "France was under darkness. Someone had to light a candle." Yet beneath the honors lay deep wounds that no medal could heal. Many of his friends in the Réseau Agir network had not survived. Some were executed, others disappeared in camps whose names were whispered like curses: Ravensbrück, Dachau, Mauthausen. Hollard often visited their families after the war, bringing small mementos, a photo, a letter, a scrap of paper salvaged from a prison wall. He rarely spoke at these visits. He simply sat in silence, the weight of memory pressing heavier than any words. The nights were worse. He woke often, drenched in sweat, hearing the creak of cell doors, the bark of German voices, the roar of the V-1 engines he had fought to stop. His wife said that sometimes he would rise before dawn, walk to the window, and stare out until sunrise, as if expecting to see the same horizon he once crossed, step by step, toward Switzerland. But Hollard refused to let pain define him. He returned to his trade as an engineer, helping rebuild bridges and factories destroyed by war. He worked with quiet precision, as he always had, rebuilding the very nation he had risked everything to save. In his workshop, among blueprints and rulers, he found a kind of peace. As decades passed, the world moved on. The war became history, its heroes fading into black and white photographs. Yet for those who knew the truth, intelligence officers in London, veterans of the resistance, Michel Hollard remained a legend. His network had provided over 120 detailed reports to the Allies. His courage had not only saved thousands of Londoners, but also proved that one determined man could wound an empire built on fear. In France, he was awarded the Légion d'honneur, the Croix de Guerre, and the Médaille de la Résistance. Streets were later named after him. But if you had met him in his later years, you would have found a modest man, walking to work with a worn briefcase and a distant smile. When asked how he managed to escape 12 times, he would laugh softly and say, "I was never escaping. I was just going home." He lived long enough to see Europe rise from the ruins, and to know that the freedom he fought for had endured. Michel Hollard passed away in 1993 at the age of 95, peacefully, quietly, as if slipping into one last escape. Today, few remember his name outside the pages of old intelligence archives. Yet every time a historian mentions the miracle of London's survival in 1944, his shadow lingers there. The man who walked across occupied France with a briefcase full of secrets and a heart full of resolve, because history often celebrates the generals and the armies, but sometimes it is saved by one man with a map, a lie, and the courage to walk alone. Michel Hollard survived the unthinkable. 30 months of torture, imprisonment, and near death. When the war finally ended, he returned to a France that barely remembered his name, but those who knew the truth never forgot. Without his maps, without his warnings, thousands of British lives would have been lost to fire. One bomb's London might have been reduced to ashes. He lived quietly after the war, far from the noise of politics or fame. No grand speeches, no medals on display, just a man who had seen too much of both courage and cruelty to his neighbors. He was simply Monsieur Hollard, the quiet engineer who walked with a limp. But to history, he was the man who defied the Gestapo 12 times and won the war with nothing but a map, a bicycle, and unbreakable faith. In the end, Michel Hollard didn't fight for glory. He fought so that France could breathe again. Next, we'll uncover another forgotten hero, a man whose silence hid a secret that changed the entire course of the war.